All right, let's get started. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Randerson. I've known him for a long time, and in fact, I remember back in 2000, he did his graduate work and his undergraduate work at Stanford, and then moved over to Caltech. And then there was wailing and gnashing of teeth when he had left in 2003 to take up a faculty position at UC Irvine, where he's now moved on to becoming the Ralph and Carol M. Cicerone Professor. And I think it's a testimony of a lot of the great work he's done. He was was noted as a highly cited researcher, and he's become an AGU Fellow, and most recently, he's now become inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. And I think it's a real excitement about the kind of contribution that he has as part of our field in biogeochemistry, his contribution to the overall science activity. Now, the other thing about Jim that I've really enjoyed, and this really came home to me several years ago, when I was at this MAP meeting, we were going and reviewing proposals. And there was Jim and there was Mike Prather. Anyone knows Mike? It's like the yin and yang of intellects at this session. And you have Mike Prather who would look through with a dissection and find everything that might not be working in that proposal. And you saw Jim coming through and looking through that proposal and saying, I think there's a gem here. I think there's some value in this proposal right here. So it's his positivity as well as his formidable intellect that's really made Jim an exciting person, not only to read, but also to work with. So with that, Jim, please come forward.
It's really nice to come back to Caltech and so many friends, and it's just it's remarkable to see the transformation over the last 15 years of earth science at JPL, and I think it's now the premier place in the entire world for studying how the earth is changing. And so I try to come up here whenever I can because I'm so jealous and envious of all the data sets and satellites that are now available to the next generation to study the Earth system. So today I'm going to talk about the global carbon cycle and how the global biosphere is changing. And I'm just showing this figure really from work that's being led by one of my PhD students, Don Woodard, to provide kind of a perspective of the carbon cycle. And so today I'm going to discuss processes that regulate the carbon uptake rate on land. Specifically, I'm going to provide several perspectives on wildfires. And also I'm going to talk about how the biosphere in the ocean is changing. Over the last decade or so, we've got a really nice appreciation from both satellite constraints and Earth system models of these natural carbon climate feedbacks. So in response to rising temperatures, the carbon sinks on land weaken in some places from changing wildfires, from other places from a loss of permafrost, from more rapid rates of decomposition, and yet other places in the tropics from drought affecting the rate of net primary production. And we also, on the ocean side, have an appreciation of how increasing stratification and decreases in solubility can lead to a buildup. And what I'd just like to highlight with a slightly different angle here for many of you is that there's really a whole parallel set of feedbacks. So while we've quantified these and we've recognized that on different timescales the land dominates on shorter timescales and the ocean's this big engine that gets more and more powerful through time, there are a set of parallel feedbacks that really operate through the economic systems. And so my student Don has been exploring this using a chi identity to break apart the different controllers on our fossil fuel emissions. And so as temperatures warm, the carbon intensity of energy may increase. It may be more difficult for us, for the same amount of carbon that we burn, to transmit electricity through power lines, or our efficiency of our transportation may change. Power plants become less efficient. And so she's tried to quantify this from the literature, looking at these inefficiencies in our energy delivery systems. And the inefficiencies tend to grow with climate warming. However, on the other side, we know that with rising sea level, with more climate extremes, with heat waves, that the global economy will take hits. And so that there will be a degradation of economic productivity from us adapting and trying to adjust to a changing climate. And so she's used estimates that were put together by Marshall Burke at Stanford of how gross domestic production or gross world production will respond to climate warming, and then fed that through this chi identity that's used in the carbon cycle to accurately calculate the effect on emissions. And there's also indirect effects on population through GDP. GDP has an effect on population, and yeah, there's a very minor effect, but I mean, it's not, I guess, minor to the people who are living in areas that are affected by extremes, but population itself can be influenced by changing climate. So when you pull these elements together, thinking about the global carbon cycle, a result emerges that's not necessarily intuitive. So we've developed formal feedback architecture and a framework, a conceptual framework for quantifying the natural carbon cycle. And so in response to warming, over the 21st century, the feedbacks with the natural carbon cycle lead to a net release of carbon dioxide. It's through increasing stratification of the ocean, which makes it more difficult for the fossil fuels to move through the mixed layer into deeper ocean layers. And on land, it's really a suppression of net primary production, primarily in the tropics, from higher temperatures and drying, and simultaneously higher rates of decomposition in soils. So that's well known. And what kind of emerged that's surprising, but from these more recent economic estimates of the costs on GDP from warming, you actually get an opposite effect. So our net economic effect here actually decreases the carbon dioxide levels as we move into the future. And these changes in CO2, when we couple them through a series of box models that were tuned to reproduce the features of the latest set of IPCC class models, the Earth system models that were a part of CMIP-5, what we find is they actually cancel each other out. So the net effect, when you consider both natural carbon climate feedbacks and economic carbon climate feedbacks, is that they're actually close to zero. And so here it's really the carbon intensity, the energy efficiency does change, but in our analysis, which I recognize is really preliminary, these effects are smaller than the damages to the agricultural sector, to sectors of the economy that then basically slow our ability to use fossil fuels. If there's less economic productivity, then we'll be burning less fossil fuels and less will accumulate in the atmosphere. And yeah, this is something that I think really highlights the importance of trying to use remote sensing observations to try to understand how climate extremes and climate change is modifying patterns of fossil fuel emissions and economic growth. So hopefully that's something that's a new twist on the carbon cycle that I think represents a frontier. And this is really, people are starting to integrate, use integrated assessment models to integrate them with their system models. And I think here we really try to take a simplified approach with this chi identity. So, so now I'd like to turn to that land component of the carbon cycle and look at the role of fire. So this, over the last 15 years or so, I've been involved in a group called the Global Fire Emissions Database Team, GFED, where we've been trying to track global fires. And this is a group with Louis Giglio from University of Maryland and Guido van der Werf from the Netherlands, from the Free University, Jim Kolatz at NASA Goddard, Ruth de Vries at Columbia, and Doug Morton at NASA Goddard Flight Space Center. And we've used MODIS observations from Aqua and Terra. We've fused it back to 1997 with observations from ATSR, a European Space Agency satellite, to create maps of global burned area. And so that's what's plotted here. And so just to highlight this, so now we have almost 2 decades, or over 2 decades, of global observations monthly. And we've actually, during the MODIS era, we've got that down to daily. And you can see interesting features in this record. For example, in the Amazon, you can see road networks when, during the dry season, they'll light up. You can see the ITCZ in Africa, where the fires are in the dry season, the ITCZ is in the north in the boreal summer, and the fires will be in the south. You can also see periodically El Nino events that highlight, well, they'll burn across the peatlands of Indonesia, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And as the ice and snow comes down in the north, oh, it's already done. Let me do it one more time. You can see those kind of variations in the length of the fire season that's regulated by the length of the growing season in the north. And so this record, we're still continuing to build it and improve it. And I've really enjoyed in my career trying to use it to understand how fires affect the Earth system through aerosols, through affecting surface albedo, looking at fire feedbacks, find that fires actually have a net cooling effect through their aerosols because they emit black carbon, but they also simultaneously emit organic carbon. And that leads to some cooling when you use an Earth system model like the community Earth system model to look at their effects. And so right now we're in the middle of actually not only plotting burned area, but we're making a data set of the perimeters of each of these fires and their ignition points and their spread rates so that you can study if fires all burn in one direction or where the fires grow the fastest, what controls the biggest fires on the Earth. Does anyone have a guess of where the biggest fires are on the Earth, which continent it would be? Africa's a good one. Anyone else? It's actually Australia has some of the biggest fires on Earth because it's so remote, there's so many cows, there's so few people that the fires can burn unimpeded for a very large area. And so these are where the fires are the largest. So from this, we can actually now start to do change detection. And so this is, I think, the first really unanticipated, well, I guess it's the second if you think about the economics, but a result that maybe not everybody in the room may have appreciated before the seminar or before reading this paper, which is that we can plot now. Oh, that's my background. I'm sorry. Sorry about that, guys. Those are cephalopods. Let me. That was unexpected. That was unexpected. Let me try that one more time. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is now the on the top panel is the annual mean burned area. So this is the annual mean over the period from 1997 to 2015. And the bottom panel is the linear trend at each location. So where it's blue, there's a loss of fire, and where it's red, there's a gain of fire. So even though over the last 2 decades, the Earth system has warmed considerably, and there's evidence that the land surface is undergoing increasing drought stress, potential evapotranspiration is increasing, and there have been papers published using FluxNet observations that suggest that evapotranspiration is becoming limited, we find that over this time period, global burned area has dropped by nearly a quarter. We've lost almost 25% of global fires. So the loss of fires is most intense across North Africa, behind the deforestation frontier in South America and Mato Grosso into the south, throughout Central America. I don't know exactly what happened to my, I've got a new opening here. We no longer need the Panama Canal. I think I think I cut out a section here. I think I've got a little invisible box. And then you can see also the Silk Road that's reemerging, and across the Eurasian steppe, a loss of fires. And also in Australia, but note in Australia, there's a really large interannual variability compared to many of these other regions. Well, there's interannual variability throughout. But okay, so why are we losing fires? Why have we lost 25% of our global burned area? And so this is an analysis now that shows this over time. This is normalized to 1. This is the relative rate of burned area. And the original observations are shown in red. And then what we did at each grid cell, 0.25 degree grid cell, is we fit a regression model to try and take into effect the effect of rainfall variability. Rainfall is the length of the dry season is a really important controller in fire in each, both in forests and in grasslands. And so we solved for coefficients at each location to try to account for rainfall, either the trends in rainfall or the interannual variability. And when we take out the effects of rainfall, we find that the trend in the black line is not affected. And so this to us is arguing that this trend is really not driven by climate. And we're using here, for example, TRIM. We used TRIM observations for this from NASA. And so so the trend, the effect of rainfall and climate is to there's a lot of variability from one year to the next. That's removed, but the long-term trend remains stable. And so So what is it then? What's going on? And so we did a lot of analysis of different data sets, including livestock density, cropland area, and changes in FAO statistics of agriculture. And basically, what we feel this trend is being driven by is it's the expansion of global agriculture through our ancient grassland systems on Earth. And so what's shown here is a spatial correlation. In each 1.5 degree areas, there's 36 quarter-degree pixels. So there's, if you think about the spatial correlation over 36 pixels of population density from the land scan product developed by the Department of Energy of high-resolution human populations, and burned area, from the mean burned area from our data set. And so what you find is in tropical forests, more people means more fire. Where you have the road networks, where you have settlements, you can have fires used often to maintain pastures, to clear new areas. And so you see that here, you see it here. However, as you move into these grassland systems, into the savanna, you get the opposite effect. So you see across Africa, across this, the Eurasian steppe, you see where more people in arid, semi-arid systems leads to a suppression of fire. And so what we think is happening here, and if I were to show you the map for livestock, it would look very similar, but it would have different structure. And it looks also somewhat similar for cropland, and just slightly different patterns. But what we feel is happening is that we've made great success over the last couple of decades in really targeting deforestation by the international community. It's been integrated into the concept of REDD+. And I think that's a remarkable achievement. And that's brought attention, for example, to the Brazilian Amazon, where there has been a decline in the rate of deforestation inside the Amazon. And there's also agreements to try to limit burning in Indonesia with Norway. But there hasn't been any similar type of investment in the savannas. And the question of how agriculture is changing savannas is a much more challenging remote sensing problem. You don't have a structural change, more difficult to see with LiDAR. And so what we think is happening is that in a lot of, it's actually these trends that I'm showing you, I'm not going to show you the plot, but all the global fire models, there's recently a project called FireMIP to intercompare prognostic models of fire that they're predicted based on first principles, and none of the models could capture this trend. A lot of them showed increases, some of them showed a stable trend, and some of them did include human drivers like population, but what's really remarkable is if you pick the top 50 countries where there's the most burning in the world, across Africa, Australia, and South and Central America, and Russia, the grazing area, the amount of area that's grazed by animals, it kind of plateaued in the 1970s and it remained constant. Basically, a lot of the available grasslands were put into pastures in the latter part of the 20th century. But if you look at the FAO statistics of the number of cattle in those grazing areas, they've gone up by 3 or 4-fold. So the cattle density across the tropics, and it's a nice, there's more protein. This is part of the success of feeding more people. There's fewer famines today. However, there's so many animals on the landscape now, I think that they're actually consuming so much grass that it's not allowing the fires to spread. And so the fires you can almost think of as a very sensitive indicator of the degree of fragmentation and the amount of fuel on the surface. And so I think it's a challenge for us. If we think about lions, for example, a lot of the remaining lion populations are in these areas where you see a loss of fire. And so it's an indication that there is potentially a degradation of the habitat that's critical for some of these important megafauna. And I would also say in this paper, we also looked at the carbon sink. So more work needs to be done with Sentinel, Landsat, and high resolution, like planet-type imagery. But in general, there's a broad set of theory that suggests when you suppress fires, then you can have an invasion of woody plants. You can have woody encroachment. And so we projected with a model that there was an increase in the carbon sink. And then there was recently a paper that was published in Nature Communications last week, 2 weeks ago, by Vivek Arora, that claimed that almost a quarter of the global carbon sink is driven by this form of the loss of fires. So it's a not negligible contributor to our understanding of the pattern of global carbon fluxes. And what's interesting is that this is really not a mechanism that's integrated well into the land use models. A lot of the land use models handle deforestation well, and they handle cohorts of trees that are moving between primary and secondary forests, but they don't have this fragmentation and the changing dynamics of the woodlands as well represented. So I think that's an interesting frontier for further research. So now I'd like to follow up on some work that really in the footsteps of Junji Liu's really nice paper in Science published last fall from OCO that showed, so it's not everywhere we're losing fires. And if that place where we lost the Isthmus Canal was a little plot of the burned area trend versus tree cover. And you actually find that in forests in the north, across like boreal North America, and in the tropics, fires are not declining. It's really the grasslands where we're losing fire. But this is an example where in Indonesia, we still have this massive perturbation that's driven by El Nino. And so I think in the OCO2 paper, really nice work, we saw that it was about between, I think, 0.3 petagrams. Kevin today showed me maybe it's closer to 0.4 or somewhere in between 0.3 and 0.4 petagrams of emission from Southeast Asia. And a lot of it is associated with fires that are on peatlands and throughout forests, lowland forests across Kalimantan, Sumatra, and other islands throughout the maritime continent. So what's shown here are the areas of peatlands that are formed during the Holocene. And there's actually some that are formed during the Pleistocene that are buried off the coast underwater when the sea level rose. And so during these El Nino events, you get these pulsed releases that OCO2 and MOPIT can see. And the underlying question that's really important is, well, where's that emission coming from? And so there's deforestation. And in an earlier paper with Guido van der Werf, we were able to show that the deforestation rate actually is climate sensitive. So you get a little bit more deforestation when it's drier during an El Nino event from people being able to more effectively use fire as a tool in the clearing process. However, you also have extensive use of fire that interacts with canals. So the canals are going in to drain the peatlands, so they're preparing them for oil palm, and then also, just as importantly, acacia for paper, for pulpwood. And so these large plantations are going in, but trees don't grow very well in flooded anoxic soil, so they're drained. And when they're drained, then it really exposes the upper levels of the organic profile to decomposition and to fire. But simultaneously, these plantations have a lifetime of economic lifetime of about, I think it takes maybe 15 to 20 years for oil palm to kind of grow to fruition, and then the crop starts to slow. They'll cut it down and they'll burn it, and then they'll restart the cycle. So they're not left there indefinitely. So a really important question is then, during this massive haze event, and I should say that not only was it a disaster from a carbon cycle perspective, where there was this huge cost from emitting this extra carbon into the atmosphere, but it also was a huge human health disaster. So there were 40 million people were exposed across Indonesia, across Singapore, to lower air quality. Depending on the study, but hundreds to thousands of people potentially had their lives shortened from the exposure to the higher particulate matter, PM2.5. And this is a picture from MODIS showing the smoke clouds across the island. And I actually worked with Mika Tosca a while ago, who then came up to do a postdoc here with David Diner on how these smoke clouds change between El Nino and La Nina periods. You can actually see the boundary layer growing and the smoke from Miser getting higher during an El Nino event from the increased energy and more energy going into sensible heat fluxes. So what's the origin of this haze? What's the origin of the carbon? Is it coming from agricultural waste burning with a lifetime of 20 years? Is it from deforestation? So trees in the tropics, the carbon, they grow up and then they die. Some trees might be 100 years, but from Luciard and other studies, also regional studies, the average lifetime or turnover time of carbon in a tree is about 60 years. And in contrast, these Holocene and these peat deposits have been building up over thousands and thousands of years. And so this is this deeper peat. So if you're burning along the surface, you're on a time scale of decades. If you're burning agricultural waste products, you're burning on the time scale of years. And if you're burning peats, it's hundreds to thousands of years. And these all, the origin of this carbon that we can see from OCO2, it makes a difference. If it's coming from here, then maybe it's really not that big of a carbon problem, because it's really emerging from, it's a steady state, like a savanna fire where it's coming in and it's burning and it's going back out. Deforestation is critically important, and a lot of the lowland forests have been lost. But your management approach for deforestation is different from how you manage the peats. If you want to protect the peats, you've got to get rid of those canals. You've got to go back in, and you've got to put dams in there and remove the canals, let the water table start to rise. And I've worked with J.T. Rieger, I don't know if I see him here, but on trying to use GRACE to look at some of these long-term changes in this region.
How do you use carbon-14 for long term? At the time when it was nuclear carbon-14.
Well, we use both. That's correct. So we use both. Yeah, I can repeat the question. The question is, how can I use radiocarbon to study this problem? The nuclear tests left a very unique signature, which I'll show in a moment. But you have two elements for radiocarbon. You have natural radioactive decay with a half-life of 8,273 years or so. And so you can look at the long-term loss of the radiocarbon, and you can use the bomb spike simultaneously. If the emissions are coming from agricultural waste burning, that's a really good question, or from deforestation, they will be bomb labeled. They will reflect, I'll show that in a moment, but they will reflect the actual imprint of the weapons testing done by the Soviet Union and the United States in the 1960s, especially like in 1962 and 63. If it's coming from peat, we should see evidence for radiocarbon in the smoke that is very old, that has had radioactive decay from this just natural process of the atoms converting back into nitrogen. So we were lucky Francesca knows, like Fu-Ming Kai he was a PhD student in Irvine, and he moved back and he did a postdoc at the MIT Singapore Alliance, the National University of Singapore, and he collected with his colleagues, Yu Lia, a series of smoke samples, of aerosol samples inside Singapore during the 2014 and 2015 El Nino. So everybody knows there was a strong El Nino in 2015, or the earth scientists in the room do. In 2014, there was actually a moderate, a small to moderate El Nino event. And so this is the total carbon content of these big aerosol, and they're high volume aerosol filters, and we collect the carbon, particulate carbon on glass filters, and then we ran them in the basement at UC Irvine. We have an accelerator mass spectrometer that has really high magnets, and it can move it can separate out the 12 and the 14C elements separately, and we can then calculate this ratio, which is the del 14C signature, which is shown here. And so in Singapore, so during the fire events, which you see here, these are Aqua and Terra active fires. You see that there's more total carbon. So these are the haze events. And then we also collected during the non-fire season when it was basically the concentrations were low during a background period. But this was a background period for the middle of a city. So in the middle of a city, you actually have del 14C values that are very depleted, because you have fossil fuels that are dominating the aerosol loading from cars and from trucks and from burning of fossil fuels. And then you see during the fires, you see this enrichment of the del 14C, meaning that we're burning more material that has ages that are younger. So if it was pure fossil fuel that was completely radiocarbon dead, it would be minus 1,000. And we are seeing numbers during the fire events that are less than 0, but between between 0 and minus 400 per mil. And then we did some runs with the GeoSchem model, coupled with the GFED emissions time series that I just showed you, to kind of illustrate where the fires were coming from. And what you find is that a lot of the emissions in 2015 were coming from Sumatra, and a lot in 2014 were coming from Borneo. And this is a run where we have the full geochem run, sampled at Singapore with fires, and then we took out the fire source, and you see the blue line. And so it just kind of confirms that fires regionally are emitting enough aerosol precursors and direct organic carbon aerosol and black carbon aerosol that the transport, after you take into account the model estimates of transport and wet and dry deposition, yield particulate matter concentrations that match the observations inside the city of Singapore at the National University of Singapore. All right, so here's the punchline from this study. So you can use something called a Keeling plot that has been used extensively in carbon dioxide research. It actually started here at Caltech. I think it was when Keeling was here with Sam Epstein down on the campus. That was when he worked up at Monterey and did his first isotope measurements with carbon-13. And so you can do the same thing with aerosol. So this is 1 over the total carbon concentration of the aerosol sample plotted versus the isotopic composition. And these are the 2 fire years. And when you fit a line through this, it's not perfect. The 2014 actually has an intercept of about -150, and the 2015 have about -50. But the average is about -76 per mil. So it is well below the atmospheric level. And so then let me illustrate that. So this is so when you use a Keeling plot, if you calculate the intercept at potentially infinite concentrations, if the total carbon went to infinity, it can tell you what that M member was. And so we're using this approach to tell us what's the fire component out of this mixture. Each sample has a mixture of both urban and the remote fire transport into that sample. And so with the -76 per mil, it actually tells us a lot about our question about what was the origin of this aerosol. So here we used a simple box model to figure out what the turnover time of carbon would be that would give us a -76 per mil del 14C value, and it's 800 plus or minus 420 years. So the smoke age is on the time scale of millennia. If it was coming from deforestation with a turnover time of about 55 years, we would expect it to pick up a lot more of the bomb. So this gentleman asked about what the effect is of nuclear weapons. Here's the atmospheric record of del 14C. So it's kind of stable. It's actually declining a tiny bit from some fossil fuel inputs. Then we have the weapons testing, and then with the success of the nuclear test ban treaty that was signed, you have this beautiful exponential decay of the atmosphere. And then that label is passing through the process of photosynthesis through the pools. And if it was coming primarily from agricultural waste burning from that oil palm, it should follow the green line. So this is a simple model estimate derived with a turnover time of 7.5 years. And then this is the line that you would expect for deforestation with a residence time of wood of about 55 years. We're finding numbers that are on the order of -76 per mil, significantly different than the background. And this just illustrates then we did this another mass balance separation of the 2 components. So these are our observations up here from the fire aerosols. And so we're seeing some values for the fires as low as -300 or 400 per mil. The mean is shown here of -76 per mil and a standard deviation off the Keeling plot. And then these are counterfactuals or what you would expect. Here's the atmospheric level in 2015 or in 2014. Here's what the distribution we'd expect from our model if it was only coming from agricultural waste burning, and here's what it is from deforestation. So these data to us illustrate and indicate that more than 90% of the emissions are coming from peatlands. And it confirms other work by Susan Page, by many others, that it's really the peat that's the origin of the carbon that's being lost. It's not coming from deforestation. It's not coming from agricultural waste burning. So this really links all the human health effects with the fact that we're actually contributing to a CO2 pulse that's going to be leading to a net buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is well before the Industrial Revolution, and so it's a quantitative way using a new measurement technique to show that you're simultaneously modifying the carbon cycle and human health with this really ancient peat. All right, are there any questions about that? I'm going to turn now to the ocean. So it's a really different topic, but it's a fun one. So this might be a good point for questions if there are any. Okay, any? Okay.
So this previous slides,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
On a bird, this is being taped. It's being taped.
You mean I keep
Careful what you say.
recording?
That's right.
Well, I have two questions then.
Yes.
Before we go to the ocean.
Okay.
This slide, the area that you're focusing on, the
Yes.
end results that you're showing, it's this Sumatra and Kalimantan and
Yes.
Borneo region.
Yes.
So the final conclusion that you had that actually deforestation has no impact here is only limited to this region. It's not.
That's right. It's really for the composition of the smoke in Singapore. In 2015, I didn't show this. There are more fires in Sumatra, and they're originating. You can see these are the number of active fires. This is a plot of active fires, total number of detects from MODIS. A lot of it came from these lowlands that are peat lowlands across Singapore. In 2014, a little bit more came from Borneo, from the Kalimantan, east-west Kalimantan provinces. So I'm not highlighting. I mean, deforestation is really a critical problem.
But they're coupled, right?
What?
The
Yeah,
deforestation
they
and
are
peatland
coupled.
burning is coupled to some extent.
They are coupled. That's right. And I don't. And Mietonen has some really nice papers. Jukka Mietonen, that unfortunately a lot of the forests have been on something like 70% of the forest has been lost over the last 3 decades on these peatlands, the surface. And so that's really. It's terrible from a conservation perspective. There are a lot of really interesting animals. There are rhinos. There are orangutans that are really that get affected by the smoke. So there's been a loss. But what this data is showing and arguing is that certainly the smoke and a lot of the carbon is really from this below ground burning from those areas that may have been previously deforested. And it's burning down into the soil. So most of it's coming from soils that have layers that are down 500, 1,000, or 1,500 years old. Does that seem?
Yes, thank you. I have another question from your earlier slides before you go to water.
Okay.
When you were looking at the models with the changes of the increasing of atmospheric CO2 and then contrasting it with the economic effect. So the only modern, maybe anecdotal example that exists with the decline of the CO2 in the atmosphere is when there is war. And when there is war, at least in the tropics, forest gets preserved, economic conditions completely diminishes and stuff. So the question is there a war in that model?
No, there isn't. It's
if not, then what's
driving it? Well, it's from Marshall Burke at Stanford. There's these things are called economic damage functions. There was early work in the DICE model, and the economists are more working systematically to understand how climate change will affect different economic sectors. So you think agriculture takes a hit from crops dying. Or movement, or extreme heat waves affecting the climate. You think about what happened to Houston, how it devastated the regional economy. Sea level rise, what the costs that we are putting in to try to rebuild, is money that may not be as effective in trying to invest in a high-tech company if you're having to build seawalls or something like that. So there's these economic feedbacks. It's highly dependent on the economists. We're using one set of estimates that we think are more state-of-the-art than the earlier estimates from DICE. But those are the effects. And you're right, there is an example. I've seen Philippe Sias's group work on this during World War II. For example, there's an anomaly in CO2 where the CO2 levels off. And there's arguments that maybe that was in part from a global disruption of the global economies. There's a debate, or even it could be a land use change recovery from less deforestation from the disruption of global shipping and things like that. So it's a good point, but I don't know if it might be that it's more implicit. I don't think the wars. I mean, what we're seeing unfortunately in Syria, and you can see the lights and things change. I've seen some of the. I don't know if it's from NASA, but some work highlighting the really different structure. Maybe it's even NDVI, the croplands. I think I saw a recent Twitter about how the crop productivity has been really affected in the Mideast, and so yeah. So I don't think it has wars explicitly. It's more of like a macroeconomic model, and so in our contribution is really trying to compare that with the putting it in a framework where you can compare these damage functions with our more we've had 10 years where we've built out the techniques for comparing carbon climate feedbacks in the natural system on ocean and land. And so I think it's important to try to figure out how important these are relative to one another and which ones you should study. So, other questions? Yeah.
I think we should go to the
Okay. All right. Is that right? I can get you, Josh, right? Do you want?
just a quick
Okay.
question. What's the time lag for your?
For which one?
From the same slide, that's how I was asking about the economics.
What's the time lag?
Yeah, so when the economic impact is felt from the climate, is there a time lag? Because usually we think of climate impacts continuing even past change of economic change.
Right.
And then I guess related to that, is there also a conversion to clean economy where the economy?
Right. Those are good. I didn't touch on that. So the questions are, what's the time lag, and then what's the effect of a transition to like a less carbon-intensive economy? What are the effects in there? So the time lag, it's actually, I haven't thought about the problem in that context. It's more about from the paper by Burke. There's a relationship between GDP costs over the 21st century for kind of an RCP 8.5 scenario as a function, and you can map that as a function of temperature. So you can develop a relationship between, it's nonlinear, between the GDP and the temperature, global temperature perturbation. And that's what we're integrating into this Kaya framework to calculate then the magnitude of the feedback when we couple it with the, it's an RCP level population and energy. And yeah, so I think does that mostly answer your question? Yeah.
It kind of seems that the carbon in your fully coupled is coming down because of the economic turn down, but usually, at least the immediate understanding is that the climate impacts continue well past any change, and it seems like it's if you shut down a factory, then your global your CO2 emissions, I guess, instantly change.
Right. That's true. That's true.
So there's no time lag.
Yeah, I wouldn't think there is. It's instantaneous. Like you're not burning fossil fuel that you would just leave that in the ground because your economy is not able to consume it. That's right. So it's a little different than the ocean. If you start changing the ocean, then you'll start having outgassing coming back, and that's in our simple box model. The ocean feedbacks to the outgassing. Okay, so 5 more minutes on the ocean. So this is work that came out of the community or system model. I was the biogeochemistry working group co-chair with Keith Lindsay. And so we conducted a series of simulations to look at the role of the carbon climate feedbacks through the year 2300. So a lot of the IPCC simulations, as you're well aware, stop in the year 2100. It's almost like we fall off a cliff. What's going to happen to the world after 2100? We don't know. So I think it's a really fascinating, deep time question. What are the consequences of steps that we're going to take over the next couple of decades? How will they play out in the Earth system over the next millennium? And so I think if we find climate biology interactions beyond this time that people haven't discovered before, might it provide stronger motivation for us to reduce and take steps to decarbonize our emissions over the next, or decarbonize our economy over the next couple of decades. So most of the work that's been done after 2100 is using something called EMICS. They're called intermediate models of the Earth system. They don't have the full physics. And so I was really excited to explore this space with CESM because it's a fully coupled model. It's got the best representation of ocean physics at a global scale, and it's coupled with my next door neighbor at Irvine, his biological ocean model. So a paper published several years ago, we looked at the carbon climate feedback, and here's the temperature, and this is, I should say, we did this simulation for RCP 8.5. So that is a scenario basically of business as usual. If we take our current trajectory of fossil fuel emissions and we don't take steps to limit emissions, we burn through a lot of fossil fuels through the 21st century. There's about 4 degrees of warming, and if you keep going out to 2300 with all that infrastructure, you burn about 3,000 petagrams. So you burn most of the proven reserves of fossil fuel. So if we burn through that, it's a world we don't want to go to, but I think there's value in illustrating a world that we don't want to go to the rest of to the public and to the rest of the science community. So this is the temperature change, 2300 minus 1850. You have in the Arctic, by 2300, 26 degrees Celsius of warming across the north. You've lost your sea ice, you've lost your snow. In Antarctica, you also see warming of the air. In this first paper that came out from these simulations, we looked at the carbon climate feedback, and the thermal haline circulation in North Atlantic shuts down. And so as a result, it's less efficient the ocean's less efficient at taking the anthropogenic carbon that we put in the atmosphere into the ocean. And so you see this plume moving from the North Atlantic down into the South Atlantic. This is a negative anomaly of carbon uptake in the oceans from the shutdown of that circulation and the pumping of carbon into the deep ocean and then back into the South Atlantic at depth, between 1,000 and 2,000 or 3,000 meters depth. Okay, so there's also really profound biological changes that go on in this simulation. And one of the ones that was really unexpected is that what we find is that you lose sea ice around Antarctica. Today, there's not, the trends in sea ice around Antarctica are not as strong as the ones that are in the Arctic. And so in the community Earth system model, you start to lose sea ice. And by the 2290s, you've completely lost sea ice around Antarctica. Simultaneously, the winds speed up. So the Hadley circulation changes. You get a more intensification and a narrowing of convection at the equator, and you get an expansion of the cells. And it pushes the winds, the westerlies, it intensifies them, and it pushes them further south. So now, simultaneously, along the coast of Antarctica, the winds are stronger, and they could potentially drive more upwelling on the coast where there's iron-rich waters. So that's what's shown here is the wind anomalies. This is the mean winds today from the model. These are the changes by the 2100. These are the changes by the 2300. And so you see that there's warming. This is now sea surface temperatures. And so you're getting, or I think it's actually the average, it's not sea surface temperature, it's like the first 100 meter of sea level change. And so you're getting about 6 to 7 or 8 degrees of warming of the water in the mixed layer. And you're seeing winds that are speeding up, the westerlies are speeding up around Antarctica in this simulation. And so as a result, you've fundamentally changed the local environment for phytoplankton. So normally the phytoplankton are limited by light, and so you've removed, because of the ice. So you remove the ice cover, they have more light, it's warmer so they can grow faster, and there's more iron availability from the upwelling rate that's coming off the continental margin. Those three things in the community Earth system model lead to a massive phytoplankton bloom around Antarctica. And so you see this is the export production. This is an indicator of the sinking organic material from the death of the zooplankton and the phytoplankton that are sinking back down into the deep ocean. As a result, that export production actually carries with it nutrients. And so what we see is that by 2300, there's a concentration of phosphorus in the deep ocean. And there's a depletion of phosphorus in the surface ocean everywhere to the north of about like 40 degrees south. And if you look at the phosphate in the deep ocean, we're not even close to being at steady state. It's just ramping up. So there's a concentration. Basically, this effect is called a nutrient trapping effect. So by enhancing the biological productivity, we're actually sending nutrients down deeper into the ocean, and it's trapping phosphorus and I could also show you this for nitrogen down in the deep ocean. And as a consequence, normally what happens is that you have upwelling of water around Antarctica, and there is some productivity, but a lot of the waters that move to the north, let's see, like the Antarctic intermediate waters, the South Atlantic mode waters, when they move north, they've got what's called preformed nutrients. They've got some nutrients in the water, and that supports fisheries. Those nutrients will upwell, and then they'll be turned into phytoplankton, and then they'll sink back down, and it's bouncing back and forth. But in the future, what happens with this increased nutrients sinking back down, the nutrients that get into these waters that move to the north, into the North Pacific and into the North Atlantic, they're depleted. There's not as much nutrients, and so this leads to a global decline in ocean net primary production via this nutrient trapping effect. People had previously documented that stratification of surface ocean waters would lead to a reduction in NPP, but this is kind of like an ocean teleconnection, and so it really gets amplified through fisheries. So in the North Atlantic, you get a double whammy. Not only do you get fewer preformed nutrients moving north because of this massive phytoplankton bloom, but you also have a shutdown in the thermal haline. So for fisheries in the North Atlantic, there's a 60% decline for trophic level 3, which is kind of like, well, off our coast, it would be like those squid I showed you, or the in the background, or it would be the like mackerel or sardines. And I think on the East Coast, it's more like herring. So there's like a 60% reduction of fisheries by 2300 from this tipping point where we lose Antarctic sea ice, causing this ocean cascade and trapping of the nutrients in the deep ocean. So, so in conclusions, economic climate carbon feedbacks may offset natural carbon feedbacks, and I think it's an interesting area to think about, trying to compare these and using remote sensing imagery to try to understand the economic versus the natural feedbacks of it in a region in response to climate extremes. Earth is losing its firepower. Indonesian fires are burning peat that's hundreds to thousands of years old. High emissions of fossil carbon with RCP 8.5 may suppress ocean fish populations for a millennium. So the decisions we make in the next couple of decades regarding whether we go up the RCP 8.5 or we're able to turn it around and go towards a more conservative set of emissions in the atmosphere, we don't really know where that's where I really want to study next. I want to understand where's that tipping point, what's the point at which we start to lose Antarctic sea ice, and try to run these simulations out to the year 3000 so we can see if there are other oscillating modes that happen in the ocean system. And then finally, my talk I think is kind of depressing because it's especially at this long time scale. So there's reason for optimism. It's really neat to see the cap and trade systems go into place in California, and now the money that the state is investing to help us figure out ways to more effectively reduce our emissions. So thank you.
So for the exciting 2300 example, is there an analog in the past that would most resemble that state?
Yeah, the last glacial maximum, where it's the opposite, possibly. So Keith Moore is starting to work on some simulations where the opposite might have happened, where you have a cooling and you have an expansion of sea ice. And so there is some evidence the ocean productivity was actually higher during the LGM, also from more dust. But what was the effect of this reversal? And what can you use sediment cores around the ocean to help you identify? So we think this would be totally reversed in the last glacial maximum. We may be able to use marine proxy records to help understand the magnitude of the effect.
Okay.
How your multi-century model accounts for abrupt climate change? You mentioned loss of sea ice, but there are possible other
That's right.
tipping points.
I didn't talk about it, but we lose a lot of the Amazon too in this simulation. And I think that's why I want to redo these simulations with the new CMIP models, because I think looking for abrupt climate change would be really exciting and helping to visualize to the public. I think it'll be very interesting to look at how hurricanes and other extreme phenomena change century by century, even if it's far into the future, to make a stronger case for emissions reductions today. So, I would argue this is a tipping point that has extreme elements that's new, but, and it's a biological one. It's not one that's traditionally thought of as an abrupt change like with like the Dansker-Esker events of ice rafting. But I do think there is a possibility if once you have this heat pulse going through the ocean deeper, the warming, right now we're in a situation where the ocean surface is stratified and it's becoming increasingly stratified. But once that pulse moves deeper, you could actually get some reorganization of the ocean. And I think that would be really exciting to look at in more detail with a higher resolution model.
So potentially you can predict younger dryas type phenomena.
Yeah, there's another working group doing that. I haven't looked at that, but you're right. That's right. Those types of phenomena I think are really important for us to make sure we can demonstrate in this type of a model.
That will be nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Other questions?
During the first part of the talk, very in beginning, so I wonder whether the change of fossil fuel emissions from the change of GDP fits back to the forcing of natural carbon cycle. So
It does in our model.
It does.
In the model, it's all interactive. So the fossil fuels go in, and then we do runs where we decouple different elements. So we'll decouple the natural carbon cycle by having the natural biosphere not see the temperature change, or vice versa for the socioeconomic systems. But it is like it. So in our modeling system, and I think you're right. They should feed back, right? Mm-hmm. The effect. It's kind of like a CO2 carbon concentration feedback. This reduction in economic activity. And I would also just want to add that it doesn't mean that it's really a good thing, and that if we have a big economic impact from climate warming, it's going to exacerbate things like income inequality. It's going to be a more difficult world to live in. It's just from a carbon cycle perspective, it may slow the rate of total buildup of CO2. So yeah, they have to be interactive, but I think that's where you can use a simple model to turn different parts off. And it is really important to have that interaction. Thank you. Yeah.
The way the model is constructed, the economic model linked to the Earth model, it's inherently retrospective. So it says, what happened in the past is going to happen in the future. So it doesn't take into account, it can't, innovation that would increase the economy despite the lagged effects. You wouldn't have better ways to transport electricity or new ways to make more of it locally, et cetera, that would take away, say, that transmission effect.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is the scenario I showed is really connected to this RCP 8.5. That was the first one that we've looked at. And there is a lot of, to generate that kind of amount of carbon emissions, there is kind of an implicit commitment to coal and gas burning to get up. So for RCP 8.5, I think the level of emissions is like 28 petagrams of carbon by the end of the century. And so then we were looking at adjustments or anomalies relative to that and using the population and the energy scenarios developed for that scenario. So I think you're exactly right, Michael. We have to think more carefully about the, and you could even imagine politically and socially, there'll be feedbacks that we are not taking into account as we see more extremes. We might hope that this will provide greater incentive for us to move on to another scenario. So I think this is really preliminary. We didn't know how to deal with that. Like, how do you deal with a feedback where, so maybe this is what you're talking about too, Junji. Like, once you have a change in the once you have an extreme, at what point will an extreme trigger us to really take steps to limit our emissions?
So one place where you think you could begin to consider this is if we look in the African region where we're seeing a lot of migration, where they have persistent droughts, and a lot of the migrants are moving northward into Europe. So if one could get GDP statistics, one should be able to see if there's a relationship between the overall economic activity in some of those African regions or the sub-Saharan regions where having those effects, and whether or not you could track those against the changes in carbon. So those could at least be testable to see whether or not you could get these sort of forcing response relationships.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Those are smaller economies in North Africa, but that would be good to try.
I'd like to ask a question for the first part of the talk, and going back to Singapore. So the samples, so the analysis was based solely on the samples from NUS. I know there's a separate high-vol sample set running since at least 2012 from NTU on the western part of the island.
Okay.
Between those two along the coastline is the major shipping operation, harbor cargo operations in that region, which would emit very old carbon in the C14 sense. Have you controlled for that?
Yes, the control is the Keeling Plot, because if presumably that, as long as that the shipping isn't affected by El Nino, then that should be a background that's embedded in all the samples that's similar. And so the effect of using a Keeling Plot where you're trying to separate an end member from an urban, and it could have a shipping component with the fires. So it's really it's the structure of the isotopes changing simultaneously with the concentrations, and the fact that we also have other evidence that it just matches beautifully with when the active fires are present and when our model of atmospheric transport says the smoke is coming from the peats and moving over to the island. So I think all those together, it's a really good point. And you could use, I would like to try to, I think it'd be really neat in the future for another El Nino to actually use a network of stations to try to separate out the burning on different islands, because some of the peats have different age structures, and you could actually try to figure out where it was burning on Borneo and Sumatra, because they should have different isotopic signatures. So yeah, good question.
We should thank Professor Randerson again.
Okay, thank you.